I hope for one of the last times that I present as a little face on the bottom of a screen, and hopefully eventually present as a real human in front of you. This is indeed a joint paper with Dan, who's here and said he will answer some questions in chat if you have them, probably give better answers than me. And this is a paper about disclosure regulations, which is in keeping, I think, with the theme of this series. But we're going to talk about a particularly, I think, interesting, but maybe a context that people haven't done a ton of thinking about, which is social media disclosure. And in particular, Instagram is going to be our main focus. So motivation really broadly. If you think about the world today, we get a lot of advice all the time from intermediaries. Start with just the biggest one. Like if I want to know about a question that I have, I probably Google it. And so Google's giving me some advice about who I should talk to or listen to about a particular question that I have. And what we're going to talk about is the fact that that advice comes not just from Google, but also from smaller scale advisors, if you like. We're going to call them influencers, people that post things on social media suggesting that maybe you should consume a product. And what's true is that, usually these intermediaries aren't being compensated directly by the followers, as I'm going to call them, by you or me who watch their, social media feed, but rather indirectly via getting some money or possibly free products from the products or services that they mention in their posts. Now, I want to point out that we're going to focus very narrowly on people doing this on Instagram, which is big business. But also I want to stress that this question is really very similar to big IO questions of the day. Like, how should we regulate Google if they might steer results to their own properties? Or, of course, how might we regulate Amazon if Amazon is deciding what search results you see based possibly on their own compensation? So we think of this paper as in keeping with that broad question of how do we regulate online advice. But we're going to focus on social media today. And whether or not to regulate this advice is a big policy concern. In fact, I'm going to tell you a little bit about disclosure regulations in different jurisdictions. And the idea here is that if ads, if you want to call them ads, we're going to call them sponsored posts. If sponsored posts are hidden, you could think of this as deceptive. The influencer is telling you to consume a product as though it were their own advice, when in fact it is, paid for. And so disclosure regulations are appearing in a lot of countries. I'm actually one thing that's a little, I thought about last night when I was going through the slides is that, our main country of interest here in some sense is Germany, not because we know so much about Germany. And in fact, many people in the audience will probably know more about Germany than we do, but because it turns out that they had a particularly stringent form of regulation that appears during our sample period. So this is a big, broad question, but narrowly, we're going to ask the question, what is the effect of these disclosure regulations in social media context on the content provided, and then on some engagement measures with followers? But we're going to be especially focused on this content idea. I want to stress that this is, in some sense, I'm going to talk a little bit about related literature in a slide or two. This is an open empirical question. The motivation from the theory side about why these regulations came into be is mostly driven by sort of the classic theory of buyer-seller transactions, despite the fact that influencers and followers aren't really the classic example of buyers and sellers. And the idea in those theories is that more information is better, and so you want to sort of know what you're buying. Now, that intuition is mostly based on a fixed supply of objects. And what we're going to talk about today is the fact that these regulations affect the content that's being produced. Now, there certainly are papers about that, specifically in the context of people providing advice. There's some recent papers. Well, 2012 is maybe not as recent as I'd like to think it is, but there's some recent papers that suggest that, it could be that these disclosure regulations are either good or bad for these advice situations. And so that's the sense in which we think there's an open empirical question to ask, which is, okay, so what do they actually do in the data? So I'm going to specifically show you some data on sort of three.
Matt, yeah. Quick question from Larry White. Larry is wondering if your setting is any different from infomercials on TV.
So that's a good question. So I think the thing about infomercials on TV, a couple of things. First of all, I think that there's if you think that people are confused about which things are the infomercials and which things are the regular programming, then I think nothing is different from infomercials. But if you think that most people can completely tell which things are the ads and which things are not, then I think this is quite different. Because what the regulators are concerned about here is that people can't tell the difference between the genuine content and the stuff that's an ad. If you want to think about an example from television that I think is related, it's that at least in the US, when I was growing up, there was a regulation that when they go to a commercial during a cartoon, they have to say, after these messages, we'll be right back, because they think that kids can't tell the difference between the ads and the show itself. And so they wanted to make sure they were disclosing to the kids, these are the ads. Very interesting, because they assumed that this kind of disclosure would work for, you know, kids watching a TV show. And so Larry's asking about product placement also in a movie in the chat. I think that that's also an interesting one. You know, I think that these things aren't completely different from that. And I'm going to talk about disclosure regulations for financial advisors, which have also been studied in the literature. So I think that these things are sort of relevant in other settings besides social media. So I don't think it's just about social media, but I do think that this is really an active policy question in the social media space in a way that it really isn't in these other cases. But I do think it's very similar to these other cases. And I watched this, I mean, I love talking about these particular regulations and stuff because I find them very interesting. I mean, you could ask another question, which is, you know, like when I was also, you know, younger, you know, Michael Jordan used to be on TV a lot, sometimes playing basketball and sometimes telling me what underwear to wear. And nobody forced Michael Jordan to say which was which, that this was one thing was his job and that the other thing was him, you know, like being paid by Hanes to tell me which underwear to wear, because they sort of understood that we knew all along which was which. And so I think that if there's a difference here, and I don't think it's specific necessarily to the social media content, it's that it's difficult for the consumer to tell which is which. Much like, you know, and I want to bring it back to the bigger, really bigger question of like, how do we regulate Amazon or Google? When Amazon shows you a search result, it's difficult to tell to what extent is this the algorithm telling me what's the best fit for me? And to what extent is the algorithm telling me what's really good for Amazon to show me? And so I think in some sense, that's sort of a related question. We're going to focus very much on the Instagram context. But anyway, this is an active policy question in this particular case. Is that good enough, Larry?
Look, I walk into a hardware store and I ask, so what's the best power drill? And how do I know whether the shopkeeper is telling me the best for me or the one that gives him the highest profit margin?
Yeah. So, I mean, you could ask that question there too. I mean, if you wanted to put it a different way, since they're not actively like instituting such regulations, there isn't an active policy question for economists to measure the impact of those policies. So if you just want to think about it that way, as economists, we usually do policy evaluation. These are policies that are being implemented. We want to evaluate them. And so you're right that maybe if we came up with some evaluation, we think maybe we should be doing this everywhere. And I agree that when you really think about the questions we have about Amazon or Google, if you think about them broadly, they could be questions about product placement in a grocery store for the store brand as compared to this. So I would love to talk afterwards about sort of the big picture of Amazon and Google. But I'm going to talk more narrowly about Instagram for a little while. And I'm going to tell you about three things in the data, basically, especially the first two, and mostly the second one, to be quite honest. First, when we started on this project, some people asked us right away, do these regulations have any bite? In other words, do they have any impact on literally the disclosure behavior, let alone the other content behavior of the people on Instagram? And so the first thing we're going to show you is that there does seem to be evidence that these disclosure regulations are associated with more disclosure. But the big question we want to ask is related to the question surrounding sort of supply of content is, how does the regulation affect the content of posts? And we're going to ask a pretty focused question, which is, does it look like more or less sponsored content? That's going to be a tricky question, because while it's going to be easy for us to measure whether or not people are disclosing, because we know what the definition of disclosure is according to the regulation, it's much harder for us to decide what the content is. And that's where we're going to do some fancier stuff. Finally, and probably only if I have some time, but I think I probably will, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how these regulations lead to changes in interaction with followers. Here, by regulate interaction with followers, I mean things like likes and comments of posts. In some sense, that might be the really underlying question you care about if you believe that those are measures of sort of how well off consumers are, since the regulators in the end really care about how well off are consumers and not how much content there is there. So those are really important questions, but I think we have the most new to say about the middle bullet point. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is going to be surrounding the middle bullet. Okay, so One of the things we're going to focus on in this particular paper is imperfect compliance. We're going to argue that there's some evidence, and I think this is going to be believable if you've ever gone on Instagram, that there's plenty of stuff that's probably sponsored and still not disclosed under the current regulations. And so we're going to do two things on that subject. We're going to have a little very brief theory model where we're going to talk about this trade-off influencers face between what you might call organic and sponsored content, and how we want to think in that model about regulation affecting the incentives and therefore the proportion of sponsored content. And what we're going to just what I'm just going to try to briefly outline is some intuition about why you should think this is ambiguous, why you should think that it's an open empirical question whether this regulation is going to lead to more or less sponsored content. And then we're going to go to the data. That's going to be the bulk of the contribution of this paper. And we're going to look at Germany and Spain in particular. The reason we're going to look at Germany and Spain is because Germany enacted disclosure regulations in the middle of our sample period and Spain didn't. So we're going to do sort of a classic difference in difference approach where we're going to think about policy evaluation by comparing Germany to Spain. What's going to be tricky is we want to know something about likely sponsorship. And our data there is going to come from natural language processing techniques that we do on the text of Instagram ads. So a big part of what we do is going to be to bring some natural language processing techniques to try to understand which things look like sponsored stuff. And then we're going to look to see how the regulations affected how much disclosure there is, but especially how much sponsorship there is and some details of that. And then, like I said, finally, something about follower engagement. Okay, so just to preview, because these Zoom talks, they get long. We're going to find a lot of stuff that looks sponsored but isn't disclosed. The disclosure regulations do lead to a lot more disclosure in Germany, but still, during the period where German influencers are doing a lot of disclosing, there's still a lot of stuff that looks a lot like an ad, but is undisclosed. And we're going to show that the amount of sponsored stuff appears to be increasing in Germany compared to Spain post-regulation by about 3 percentage points, which is like a 10% increase in the amount of sponsored stuff. And it's not just coming from disclosed stuff. Even if we just look at the undisclosed posts, they're looking, and the word I'm going to use, although it's a little unfair to these influencers, is spammier. So think of the sponsored stuff as the spam, although you don't have to think of it that way, of course. I mean, you could like the ads that you see on Instagram, but I'm just going to use that word colloquially. In some sense, even if you look among the undisclosed posts, they're looking spammier post-regulation. And then finally, the engagement. Consistent with that, we're going to show that things like likes and comments fall on average in the period in Germany after regulations are introduced. So that's sort of going to be the main results. So quick literature slide, and then I'll get to our contributions. There are some recent papers on specifically these markets for influence. These are all theory papers, and we're providing some empirical analysis. Also, our paper focuses, when we went to the data, we were immediately struck by the fact that there's probably a lot of undisclosed sponsored content. And when disclosure rules are studied in these papers, that's not really the focus of the theory. So we're going to introduce a little bit of original theory just to make sure that we have a theory that's sort of consistent with what we're seeing in the data a little bit. A really important literature that I just want to talk about for a minute is the broader literature, empirical literature, on the effect of disclosure regulations on advice quality. These papers are often in the finance context where there's disclosure regulations. Your financial advisor has to say, hey, I get a cut if you buy this particular financial product. And there's really cool papers about, for instance, cross-border differences in the US between states that have different regulations. One of the things that's different about us compared to those papers is those papers tend to think compliance is pretty good in the states where compliance is required. They have a big advantage over us. They can measure what the advice is. They can measure what stocks did the advisor suggest. We're going to have to use our natural language processing to do that. So that's going to be a little bit harder for us. On the other hand, one of the things that's good for us is we can measure compliance in some sense directly, because we can see whether your post said this is an ad. So in some sense, I think we have more data than they do about compliance, and we have a little bit less data than they do about exactly what the form of advice is. And then finally, I just want to say, because we're going to use, and I'm going to talk more about this later, because we're going to use our data is going to be text here. We're going to be in the spirit of recent papers that have used text in lots of different contexts as data inputs. And that's going to mean using some natural language processing techniques. There's some words down there about that, but I'll just talk about the natural language processing when the time comes, because I think it's easier to understand in the context of what we're actually doing. Okay, so some theory, some data, some results, and then conclusion, if I have time for all that. Just quick words about Instagram. There's a lot of sponsored content on Instagram. I think most everybody's aware of this now, that social media influencers get paid for what they post. We have some information, a little bit of information from intermediaries that intermediate between firms and influencers about how much influencers get paid. They get paid, varying amounts depending on how famous they are and things like that. Contracts usually specify what they're supposed to say. So in other words, you're basically told, post this. There's patchwork regulation of sponsored content in different jurisdictions. What I want to stress is that Germany has had pretty strict labeling requirements since late 2016. So that's going to be one of our dates when the requirements came into being. By mid 2017, they were fining non-compliance pretty heavily in some cases. By comparison, a lot of other places have non-binding recommendations or public letters to influencers. Spain has not even that. So they're going to be sort of our other group. I think there's some questions in chat, so I want to make sure I take those before I jump into theory.
It's Muli Modak has a question comment writing, this is not related to Instagram, but if you consider YouTube, influencers are compensated by YouTube by views, which is an indirect compensation. Sometimes the YouTube influencers post discounts on the products they're talking about. This, I guess, would increase the views and hence the compensation. Also, this implicitly implies disclosure, and its regulation is not necessarily necessary for disclosure. These influencers are also quite popular because everyone loves discounts.
Yes. So I will say, I do know some things about YouTube. We're not using it here for a bunch of reasons, but notice that, for instance, in the US, so first, YouTube influencers do often get paid to do a particular thing. A classic case, Shadows of Mordor case in the US, where basically this influencer PewDiePie was paid to review a video game, but to provide a good review basically for a video game. And they found the disclosure was insufficient there. So there was very similar situation to here, although you're right that they were paid by, in some sense, by ads, from YouTube based on views. They also were getting direct compensation, much like the form of direct compensation we're going to study here.
Dan Savell has a quick follow-up or somewhat unrelated question. How do you code the following: influencers who receive a product for free but are not paid for the post itself? So
a couple things about, I'll get to that when we talk about the data. First of all, I'm not going to know anything about what they get paid. I'm going to look at the words and try to guess in some sense whether I think they got paid. And where here I want to think of get paid to include free products. I say that because that's what the regulation says. The regulation says if you got the product for free, you're supposed to say so. So in that sense, like, I want to consider that as like money because the regulation considers it like money. So I'm going to, in my head, I'm thinking about that way. There's not going to be anything to code here, though, because in practice, what I'm going to have is data from Instagram posts themselves. And I'll show you exactly what we're going to do with that. That's the sense in which I think part of the contribution here is this sort of text to data approach where we're going to not have much information about the details of the actual sponsorship. So we don't have anything to code in that case. But in terms of thinking about it, I want you to think about that as sponsored because that's the way the regulator thinks of it. Okay, so quick discussion of a model because I think it'll help us think about what we're measuring here. Because our data in the end is going to be words. And so I want to have some idea about sort of how we're thinking about the process of the relationship between an influencer who posts these words and a follower who potentially engages with these words, just at a really abstract level. So imagine an influencer that could choose the proportion of posts from each of two categories and think of, we call them A and B, but think of them, the A is like the organic posts and the B is like the sponsored posts. They're maybe kind of bad for the follower, we're going to assume here, you see in a minute. And a post this is going to be important for our sort of data view of the world, is that a post implies a distribution of words drawn from a distribution that's different for type A and type B posts. That's going to be something we're going to be exploiting here, is the idea that we think that the sponsored stuff generates different words from the non-sponsored stuff. And so this idea that sort of the which type determines the distribution of words is consistent with the contracts that I mentioned, where when you sign one of these contracts, you're basically told what to post. So that's sort of the sort of big picture way we're thinking of the data generating process, at least at the conditional on A or B for the words that we see. Now, if the way we want to think about this model, and I'm going to talk about the details, although they're in the paper, which we ended up not distributing, but we'll be distributing very shortly. The influencer cares about engagement, and other things equal wants to post B posts because they get paid for them. So B posts are going to be more valued by the influencer by a constant fraction. And the influencer cares about engagement, where engagement is a choice variable of the follower that they make based on the words. In other words, the follower reads the words, has a posterior belief about the likelihood of this particular post being from the A or B category, and spends more time engaging, the more likely they think it's a type A post. So the trade-off here is that when you draw your words from the type B distribution, you're likely to get words that people don't want to engage with, but you get paid more by a constant fraction lambda. So this is going to be the tension for the influencer, this tension between getting better words from the A distribution in terms of engagement and getting more per level of engagement from the B distribution by a fraction lambda. And so what we show is basically just as a cutoff lambda. So imagine you draw this lambda every period. That's like your opportunity for sponsorship. The higher is lambda, the better opportunity you have for sponsorship. If you get a great opportunity for sponsorship, you post something from the B distribution, the sponsored distribution. And if you don't, you post something from the A distribution because it gets more engagement. And so this will allow us to have a model where in equilibrium, we observe both sponsored posts and unsponsored posts. And those posts will generate different word distributions, which is what we're going to measure in the data. We're going to be measuring essentially words in the data.
Let me interrupt you real quickly. So Xenia had a question in the chat. Dan answered it, but I would like to follow up on it really quickly. So she writes, it also could be the case that users try to become influencers by posting something that looks like an ad, but they were not yet paid. They include the hashtag of the brain to attract the brain's attention. Now, Dan's answer was, this is not so important in the data, but I'm wondering, would your model allow for that possibility? Could you sort of embed this possibility of I'm trying to mimic being an influencer, paid influencer, maybe to be picked up by Nike and then in the future be paid by Nike, for instance?
So I don't think it's in our model the way it's currently written, because our model the way it's currently written is basically designed for the kinds of influencers we're going to study, which are sort of people that have already maybe not made it big, but made it some. I'm going to show you more about those influencers in a minute. I mean, I think what you have in mind would probably be better served by, first of all, maybe a dynamic model, which this isn't. This is just a static trade-off between, posting the A words and posting the B words. And so it feels like some interaction between posting the B. You have a situation where I'd really like engagement, but really I'd like engagement with the B words and not the A words. And here we sort of have that because lambda is a multiplicative factor with engagement. So in some sense, there is that part of it. But I think we need to have more of a dynamic model to address the sort of life cycle of influencers. And we'd really like to do that. When I talk at the end about sort of things we're thinking about more of a model-based approach to our estimation, more like a structural model, where something like that might be possible. But we'll see. Dan and I have definitely talked about dynamic models in this area before. So we're definitely thinking about that. Really, all the model's trying to do for us here is just give you a framework for thinking first about where do words come from. And so that's going to be relevant to our empirical strategy, which I'm going to talk about on the next two slides. And then second, what is regulation? Because of course, that's the other thing we're going to observe. We're going to observe when people essentially do what the German government asks them to do if they're trying to disclose. The German government is specific about what you're supposed to add to a post if you're trying to disclose it as an ad. And so I need to have a sense in the model of what we're going to call that. So that's going to be what I'm going to talk about on this slide. So simplest thing, just imagine that a fraction of all type B posts are marked with an extra expression, hashtag ad. And of course, in practice, there's a list of things you can write to disclose your post as sponsored. And let's just imagine that's never used in type A posts, which is, it sort of goes back to the question. We're going to be imagining that you only disclose stuff that's actually sponsored. We think that's accurate for these influencers, but could be different for other influencers. Now, here's the thing about that. That regulation has an ambiguous effect on the cutoff strategy. How big does lambda have to be to post from the B distribution? Because on the one hand, if a follower knows because of hashtag ad that this comes from the B distribution for sure, they're not going to engage much under our assumptions. They want to engage more with A posts than B posts. They won't engage much with the hashtag ad posts. However, every B post that doesn't get disclosed, in other words, that slips through the regulation, gets more engagement under regulation. Imagine the posts were just one word, either love or sale, where love usually comes from A and sale usually comes from B. Regulation means that if you post sale and it's not marked with hashtag ad, then for a fixed fraction of posts that get regulated, people trust the unregulated sale posts more. And that is working in favor of the influencer wanting to post more of the word distribution that draws sale pretty often, the B distribution. So that's going to be one way to think about sort of our empirical approach to unregulated stuff, and why there's an open empirical question here, because it's not obvious that this kind of disclosure, at least, would make you, as an influencer, less interested in posting B-type posts. We can do similar things with word-specific regulation. Imagine there's 3 words, love, sale, and trick, where the regulator goes after the word love very frequently. So if the regulator goes after the word love very frequently, when this still may have the same effect, that after some fraction of the love posts are regulated, you post more things from the B distribution, which leads to more posts that may have the word trick, if trick is disproportionately from the B distribution. We're thinking of B, the trick word, as like a sort of fake word, one that's not like caught by the regulators, but that is disproportionately associated with the B distribution. Okay, so the important point here is undisclosed sponsored posts may look different from sponsored posts, because undisclosed sponsored posts may look like the trick word, and disclosed sponsored posts may look like the love word, because the regulator may be going after the obvious stuff, sorry, sale word. The regulator may be going after the obvious ads that say sale, and that the real sponsored posts may also include the word trick. And so we're going to need to have an approach, a method of attack, to try to suss out which of the posts are sponsored, even though some of them are not going to be too obvious. That's going to be what I'm going to just talk about one slide here at the very end that's going to link to the data, and then I'm going to start looking at the data. So if the regulation were not word specific, like our first example with just love and sale, we could just look at the German disclosed posts and ask what words show up frequently there, and use that as our measure of whether or not something is probably an ad. In that model, that would literally be an empirical approach. But in the model where there's words like trick, imagine you see a post that's trick, trick, if there were 2 words in a post. It's never regulated because the regulator is only going after the word sale. But we need to find some way to assess, even though it never shows up in the regulated post, whether or not we should be concerned that a post like trick, trick is probably sponsored. And so what we're going to do there is sort of broadly, our empirical plan of attack is going to be 2 things. One is we're going to use information about the meaning of words in the language. So we're going to ask, does trick's meaning happen to be more like sale or love in language uses? We're going to do that through something called word embeddings that I'll tell you more about in a minute. And then we're going to use an ML algorithm that's going to look for correlated usage in our disclosed posts. In other words, if sale and trick happen a lot together in disclosed posts, we're going to be suspicious that trick is the kind of word that shows up in sponsored posts. And our ML algorithms are just going to put some structure on what sort of correlation structures we're going to look for. Okay, and we're going to use a bunch of them. So I want to get to the data because that's really the main contribution of the paper. So for the second half of the talk, I'm going to talk just about the data, but I should pause for a minute, just make sure there's no other questions I should answer.
Currently see none in the chat window. Anybody, any questions? Dan Savell with a question. If influencers are experts and experts sound like other experts, is it likely that you improperly group expert posts as sponsored? So as an example, expert photographers tag a Nikon lens when they use it. Some experts are paid by Nikon, others are not. Experts use similar tags and wording except the disclosure.
Yeah, that's one I hadn't heard before and I think is interesting. I mean, since our stuff is always going to be difference in difference, what I'm always worried about is mistakes that I'm going to make that are going to be correlated with the date of introduction of the regulation. So most of the time when people tell me about mistakes that I might make in my the job I do in identifying these posts, I'm not too concerned because I don't think it's correlated with the regulation. But yours sounds like one I definitely should be concerned about. Because if the regulation made it easier to be, say, for instance, because now the non-experts are having to disclose and the experts can, and so that the date of regulation makes it easier to enter as an actual expert, then that does sound like a mistake I would make, that would be potentially make, that would be correlated with the date of introduction. However, I'm going to say the sense in which that I think I'm a little bit safe here. So practically here, I may have experts, but I have all influencers in my data, and I'm going to tell you about that in a minute. So I'm not going to be looking at like sort of the universe of humans that might post things on Instagram. I'm going to be looking at a particular sub-universe of influencers and asking what sorts of stuff do they post. So in that sense, I think I'm in better shape than I might be if I was applying my algorithm from influencers, sponsored posts, to the whole universe of Instagram posts that I might observe. Okay, so let me tell you about my data. Our data, I should say. I always talk in the first person about my papers, but usually my co-author's not like pacing. He's kind of pacing there. I think he's worried about me. Right there in the audience. So our data, random sample of 6,000 German and Spanish influencers. As I said, the reason that we're choosing Germany and Spain, it's not just because we want to get invited to talks in Germany, although we do like getting invited to talks in Germany, but because Germany had the sort of stringent regulations and Spain didn't. We get these names from an independent firm called Hype Auditor. These firms, if you're not familiar with them, they basically intermediate transactions between influencers and the companies that want to buy posts on influencers' accounts. What's cool about that is that they have a lot of their business, Hype Auditor, is having a lot of information about these influencers that we can use. First of all, these are all fairly successful influencers in the sense that they all have at least 10,000 followers. That doesn't make them super successful, but that makes them, fairly successful. And they're all in this market because the fact that Hype Auditor has their name kind of means that they're in this market for taking money in exchange for posts. The real thing that's special about what we're getting from Hype Auditor, I think, is that Hype Auditor, one of the things they want to sell to companies is this influencer will reach people in Germany. Because as an advertiser, you care about that. And that's good for us because we're going to take only influencers that we're going to call, Hype Auditor is just an ad agency. They're just an ad agency in this space. But what an ad agency, that's what Larry said. But what an ad agency in this space does is things like be able to verify that our German influencers are operating in the German market. And that's important for us as IO economists because that's what we want. We want German influencers that are under the German regulation reaching a separate audience from the Spanish influencers who are under Spanish regulation. So these influencers won't be a famous soccer player in Germany because those people reach across borders. We also know a little bit about I'll call it the industry, but it's called topic in this data, which is basically just what they post about, which is useful because if we're going to run IO regressions, we're going to want to have information about industry to control for, and we have some of that. And again, that comes from Hype Auditor. Then we have information about the posts, specifically mostly about the text. We also know, of course, the date of it. We know a little bit of information about likes. Oh, we know the number of likes and we know the number of comments, but not the text of the comments and some other characteristics. A little bit of data on how many followers at the time of the post, but that has many missing values. We have an overall number for followers from Hype Auditor, but the time series of followers we have a little less information about. This data comes from CrowdTangle, which is Facebook. It's basically just we're getting this directly from the source. It's just this is Facebook's arm that distributes this data. So any questions about what the data is? It's text mostly. It's mostly the words. I'm going to show you some pictures in a minute, but it's mostly the words associated with an Instagram post. I know that may seem a little weird because Instagram's about posting pictures and we're not using the images, but for one, we don't have that data and we're maybe not sophisticated enough to figure out how to use it. So we're going to have two steps to our methodology, and we're going to apologize, but this is kind of the state of the art in this kind of thing for our two hands. On the one hand, we're going to do some measurement to determine what's sponsored and what is not using some machine learning algorithms. but not doing anything about our causal inference about what the effect is of these. And then we're going to use that in our causal inference to run a diff and diff regression to basically see, is there more, does there look like there's more sponsored content in Germany post-regulation? We're going to do some other things like coarsened exact matching. That basically just means we're going to bin up a bunch of conditioning variables and make sure that there's data from both countries in every bin. Is there a question in chat? I'm accustomed to monitoring chat, but Dan looks like he's maybe got it. You could stop me if there's need for more. Okay, so this is kind of an unnecessary post, but I just want everyone to understand what an Instagram post is. So, and what sort of disclosed posts and undisclosed posts might look like in our data. So this is not an influencer that's in our data set. This is a very, very famous and successful Instagram influencer, Kylie Jenner. The top left post is a post where it is disclosed as an ad. It's for something called Teeny Tea. And so that would be like a what we would call a disclosed sponsored post. The bottom left is a post that is I mean, using your common sense, is a sponsored post that Adidas pays for. We call sponsored. It is not disclosed by German disclosure rules or US disclosure rules. And then the two on the right, those would be subtler. The one on the top right, there's really not much text, so we wouldn't have much to do with that post. I think we drop all the posts that have no text. So that one actually, I think formally would be dropped from our data set. And the bottom right one is an interesting one because I think it's questionable whether this is sponsored or not, but that's definitely undisclosed. And so this is what our data looks like.
Matt, a quick question by Engshi Leka. So she writes, if I understand correctly, as you talk about likes and comment, you take into account, but your data just contains the posts and not entire stories.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we just have fixed posts and not stories. However, for a bunch of our data, the stories are going to be less relevant on Instagram than they are today. Stories are just another type of Instagram post that we don't have data on. So that's true. I think on likes and comments, that's a bit, I want you to kind of not focus on likes and comments because that's going to only show up in the very last regression. And for the most part, we're going to be focused on the text as the data from these posts. So I just want to keep our attention on the text mostly because that's going to be the main thing that we use. So I'm going to just show you a quick picture. We're going to do more formal stuff with timing tests and all that stuff, but just to sort of show you back of the envelope that suppose we just went and looked for disclosed posts, where here disclosure is just defined by the German government to be a list of words you can add to be properly disclosing your post as an ad. And then we can just measure how many times those words or related words in Spain show up in Spain and Germany. And you could see that, the main thing I want you to take from this is that, post disclosure rules and the two dotted lines, the first one is when they announce the rules. The second one is when they start issuing the fines. That the red line's a lot higher, and we're especially going to be interested in this period up here where disclosure is high and kind of settles down a bit. So we're going to use this period up here particularly. But the main thing I just want you to see is that in some sense, and you might be worried about parallel trends and all that stuff. We'll come back to all that stuff. I just want you to see that if you're one of these people that thinks disclosure rules sort of had no effect, I think this picture is pretty compelling that there probably is an effect there. But we're going to come back to more formal tests in a minute. But I do want to show you that there's some variation there. Okay, so that one was easy because we just go through the data and look for those words. But what we really want to know is, yeah, the spikes are Christmas. I'm pretty sure. Sorry, I can't help but monitor chat a little bit because I'm used to my teaching persona, which involves monitoring chat a little bit.
There's also a question by Marit. Is the data about posts at the time it was posted or at the time you collected the data? Should we be worried that influencers go back to add disclosure tags to their old post when they become aware of the regulation or receive a warning from the regulator?
It's definitely as of when we collected the data. Dan, how much can you edit an Instagram post?
I mean, you can edit it in principle, but I don't think it happens that often because most of those posts are really hard to go back to. Also, I mean, we collected the data in, I think, 2020, so it's at least 3 years. So, I mean, everything would be already corrected if it was. So we might be overstating the amount of disclosure a little bit, but not necessarily the trends.
Do posts
Dan.
show if they've been edited?
Not in the way we,
No.
not from our side, I don't think. I mean, I don't remember that as a thing. The law does not apply retroactively, so they don't fine you for having not disclosed before the announcement was made. So if that's what you mean by retroactively, there would be no incentive to go back and disclose. I mean, there might, I don't want to say no incentive. There'd be no regulatory incentive to go back and edit your posts from pre-disclosure era to try to avoid getting fined for those. Okay, so, Dan's probably looking at the clock and saying, Matt's not doing that great a job, so I better pick up the pace. So here's the main thing we're going to do. We're going to spend some time trying to figure out what among the undisclosed posts might be sponsored. Now, first of all, just like sort of as a sanity check, we did a sort of brief MTurk survey of the undisclosed posts after regulation, and real humans do believe that a lot of these posts are probably ads. So we do believe that there's something there. We're not going to use the MTurk approach to classifying these things, partially because there's, although you may only say 6,000 influencers, it's a lot of posts. And practically, we want to have something sort of a little more systematic. And so we're going to have two sort of sets of systematic ways to try to uncover posts that we think are probably sponsored. The first one's easy to understand. It's just we're going to take a fixed list of words like discount and code and links to websites and buy this kind of words, sort of just a list that we make. And we're just going to manually classify a bunch of posts as having these words and therefore, being probably sponsored. Now, that might not be that compelling because we had to pick the keywords ourselves. So what we're really going to sort of point to is a supervised machine learning approach to measuring, in some sense, what things look like German disclosed posts. Again, we're thinking that all those German disclosed posts were indeed sponsored. We're going to use the period after regulation settles down, that point that I highlighted up at the top of the red line. And what are we going to do with those posts? We're going to do two things. First of all, we're going to convert the posts into something called embedding space. So basically, we're going to turn posts into a 300 vector of numbers that's supposed to describe their meaning. These things are well used in natural language processing. So you have like a 300 vector where things that are close in terms of cosine distance are similar meanings. So that's one thing we're going to do that's going to help us to see whether or not people are using words that are of similar meanings to the ones in the disclosed posts. And then we're going to use these classifiers on the embeddings to try to predict, in some sense, to try to partition the space into sort of what categories of posts in terms of their embeddings are predicted in terms of being predicted to be like German disclosed posts to be probably sponsored. And then we're going to project that training algorithm on everything else. So once we have the training algorithm done, that tells us sort of what sort of embeddings should we be looking for and thinking of as probably sponsored. We're going to do a lot of different, if you want to think about it, these classifiers just put some structure on, in some sense, the joint distribution of, if you want to think about it broadly, the sort of joint distribution of words in posts. So they put different structure on. So we're going to use a bunch of different ones: negative, binomial, stochastic gradient, decision trees, random forest. That's what all those letters mean. And so we're just going to do a lot of different ones. We're going to find that the results are the same regardless of which of these many things that we do. So we're going to be pretty robust there. So some summary about what's going on here. Our classifiers pick up about, if you just look at the disclosed ones, they do pick up like 70 or 80% of them. So they do a decent job picking up the disclosed posts. You could also do this thing for the machine learning method called the recall score, which has a sort of similar interpretation. And of course, keep in mind that these machine learning approaches, we're always measuring these successes out of the sample that we fit to because of fivefold cross validation and machine learning fun words like that. But I want to point out that our classifiers also pick up many false positives. That is, they say that there's many things that they say look like sponsored posts but aren't disclosed in Germany. Now, usually when you're doing machine learning, that would just be a miss. But we don't want to interpret those things as just misses. We want to interpret those things as we're possibly picking up stuff that's sponsored and not disclosed. And in fact, those false positives are indeed correlated with what the humans say is probably an ad. The classifiers agree with one another, but are far from unanimous. In other words, agree with one another on average. And we're going to use them all in different ways. Okay, so I'm going to get to the main results now in the last sort of 10 minutes, but this sort of sets the stage. This is going to be a key variable that we use, which is going to be how we're measuring going from the text of these posts to how spammy, to use my colloquial term from a little while ago, are these posts.
Matt, a quick question. How does the fact that the treatment and control groups are in a different language affect this classification? Can we compare or calculate distance between the vectors across different languages? Question from Jan Lau.
Yeah, so I should have mentioned this. We use this multilingual embedding space. So the way to think about this is, so the way these embedding spaces work is that they're going to convert every language, the dictionary of every language, into a list of 300 vectors of the meanings of every word. And so they do this for German and they do this for Spanish. And for languages like German and Spanish, which are pretty similar, those 300 vectors, like once you kind of line them up so that, you sort of make cat like cat, they sort of get all the words. They sort of are sort of language independent, because you sort of like match up this big vector space. You sort of match them up across the two languages so that cat is like cat. And then it sort of like super magically makes the meanings of the Spanish words a lot like the German words. Now, it could be the case that we're messing up the Spanish classification compared to the German classification. But remember, our big concern is, are we changing how much we're messing it up at the date of German regulation? Which I'm not saying you have to be sure we're okay on, but I want to point out that if we're sort of missing some Spanish stuff because we're not doing quite as good a job, and I don't think it's necessarily because of the translation. In fact, I think these embeddings, when we discovered this embedding space, I think that was like a big bonus for us, because we were trying to figure out how to deal with multiple languages. And this gives us a nice consistent way where we don't have to worry about whether or not our translation algorithm knows whether terrific and I'm going to use English words here, but whether terrific and fantastic are almost the same word. The embedding space knows that. So in some sense, that embedding space is doing a lot of work for us, and it's language independent. So a word that means something like terrific in German and in Spanish should have roughly the same vector, 300 vector. Okay, so just now I got 10 minutes or so. I want to just tell you about the main results. So most of our regressions, I'm going to show you some raw data in a second, but most of our regressions are going to be the usual diff and diff form, where we're going to have a bunch of controls X and then an interaction term between you're in Germany and its post-regulation. That's the reg variable, and we're going to show you some coefficients on that. We're going to, although I'm not going to show them to you in the next 10 minutes, we do tests for pre-trends where we include also, whether or not you're in Germany and the date is 1 year or 1 month or whatever, 1 year before the regulations kick in. So we're going to look to see if there's other coefficients that are significant, and they're not. So we're good on pre-trends. We include some information about demand shocks in the two countries by going to Google Trends and figuring out how many Google Trends searches there were for Instagram at the month level in each of these two countries. So we're sort of trying to account for the fact that Instagram may have had differential levels of popularity and shifts in popularity across the two countries at different times that you might be worried could be correlated with the date of introduction of this regulation. I should point out our regressions here are all going to be aggregated to the influencer month level. So we're going to be kind of asking, how much spammy stuff does this influencer post per month? That's going to be sort of our level of aggregation. And we do this coarse and exact matching, which I mentioned before. And so we're going to be restricting to these bins where we have data in both countries, where we're matching on things like, for sure, on things like the industry that they're in. Okay, so I want to show you just a quick picture of some raw data here. But I want to just highlight one thing about this picture. There's a red line that I'm going to focus on. There's some dashed lines. Those are not standard error bars. I will describe what they are in a minute. But when you see a picture like this, I think you're always tempted to think those are standard error bars, which they are not. So what is this? This is just, I'm going to do actual regressions in a minute, but we wanted to show you something that's a little more raw. This is just the difference between what our algorithm says is the average share of sponsored stuff in Germany as compared to Spain in each of these months before and after the regulation. And the red line here is the average of all our different ways of measuring on the left panel with our machine learning classifiers, and in the right panel where we use our machine learning classifiers, and then also add in all of those manual words. And what I want you to see here, the dashed lines aren't standard error bars. They're all the different classifiers' opinions of how this data is moving. And then the red line is the average of all the dashed lines. So if you just look at the red line, what we're trying to show you here is, in some sense, what is the raw data that's generating the underlying coefficients? The red line, what I want you to hopefully see is that it's higher to the right of the dashed lines than it is to the left of the dashed lines. That's sort of the main idea. But of course, you might be, worried about, I'm going to run a regression. So let's just run a regression here. Okay, so here's some regressions. So we're going to start with the measure of how much stuff do we think looks sponsored amongst all posts that the influencer makes. And there's a lot of columns here because we're going to do it 8 times for our 4 different classifiers and the 4 different classifiers mixed with the manual assignment. So the top 4 are the 4 different classifiers and the bottom 4 are the 4 classifiers mixed with the manual assignment. And what I want you to see here is they're all significant and they're all kind of similar numbers. You know, this is where we get our sort of 3% number. So I mean, that's being conservative. Some of them go higher than 3%, but that's sort of, this is where our 3% headline number about how much sponsored stuff there is in Germany post-regulation. This is where it comes from. And that's 3% on a pre-treatment mean of something like 30%, roughly. That's where those numbers are coming from. Now that's interesting, but you might think, but wait, does that just all come from additional sponsored stuff that's disclosed? So I think one of the, for me anyway, I think this is like maybe the coolest regression of the bunch. This is the regression where we just look at the non-disclosed posts and ask what's going on with how much stuff, to some sense, to use the colloquial term, looks spammy to our classifiers among the undisclosed stuff. And that's going up too. Now, that's very important because to a regulator, if you told them, sure, maybe sponsored stuff is going up, but if we're getting it all disclosed, that's probably, you know, that's sort of like how we want at least we're getting it all disclosed. But this is suggesting that even amongst the undisclosed stuff, you're having potentially, we don't have much to say about welfare here, but at least potentially thinking about our model, potentially some sort of negative effect, even amongst the undisclosed stuff. So I think this is sort of the second headline. These numbers aren't quite as big, but they are significant. Okay, so I said I was going to do a few other things. I wanted to show you a couple of other things before I wrap up. So in particular, the first regression there, that's just how much is going on in disclosure in Germany. That very first picture I showed you with the red line and the blue line comparing Germany to Spain was supposed to convince you that there's more disclosure in Germany post-regulation. This is just turning that into a regression result similar to the last one where we're regressing the usual stuff on how much stuff is disclosed. This is where we just use the manual assignment of not the machine learning classifiers. And then the last column here is kind of important relative to our model. Our model was focused on one post. So you might say, but what if the total supply of posts goes up? There's no evidence, no statistically significant change in the number of posts influencers are making post-regulation. So that's sort of consistent with our model's view of the world of just sort of a fixed supply in number of posts per unit time. Okay, so oops. Finally, I just want to talk a little bit about engagement. This is the one place where those engagement numbers are going to come in. I should say we've done some of this stuff. This stuff we can sort of do at the post level, because if you think about number of likes, that's really a post level measure. So we have also run similar regressions at the post level, but this one is easier to sort of digest right now because it's exactly the same regression format where we aggregate to the influencer month level. And this is sort of total number of likes that you receive, or average, I guess, number of likes that you receive across your posts, aggregated to the influencer month level. And so what you're supposed to see here is engagement is falling with German influencers post-regulation. Now, remember, our model doesn't say that's necessarily a bad thing. If it's falling because people are engaging less with the sponsored stuff, that's kind of good in our model. But to the extent that they're overall engaging less, that could be suggestive that they're not as interested in these posts and that they're kind of worse for the followers than before. And also, finally, we have some stuff about the number of followers. I should point out, notice that there's a lot less data in that third column than in the first two, because as I told you, we have some aggregate follower numbers for these influencers, but if we want to chart their followers across months, there's a lot of missing variables there. And so we don't get anything significant there. There's a lot less data in that regression. Okay, so I have like 4 minutes left, which is perfect because there's a couple things I want to talk about in terms of robustness and additional results, especially bullet point 3, which I think is another cool thing, which we don't have on the slides because I think I could say it in words just fine. So first, timing tests. For the main outcomes, like those main regressions that I showed you with the 3% numbers and the ones that followed, we of course then rerun them where we add interaction terms between Germany and dates that occurred before the regulation. And those earlier dates aren't significant. That's consistent with the idea that our timing tests are okay. We can also do with some of our machine learning classifiers, we have a prediction about whether or not a particular post is spammy or not, like actually classified, not just a probability, for instance. And or with probability distributions, we can ask, does the probability distribution over posts spamminess change significantly? So we could just ask, do distributions shift? And we see that the distribution of spamminess does indeed shift in Germany after regulation. We just measure those distributions directly. Bullet point 3 is sort of maybe the thing I want to stress on this page the most, because I think it's super cool. If you believe these embeddings, and we didn't invent these embeddings, they're sort of like super magic invented by computer scientists. What we can do is we can measure the meaning change in posts. This is not about whether it's more or less spammy, but just whether or not the regulation is affecting what people say by looking at, take the meaning of every post and calculate its distance from an arbitrary vector, like a vector of zeros, and ask what's going on with the distance from 0 of the meaning of posts before and after regulation. And so what this is saying is, this is no machine learning classifier. This is just the word embeddings, and ask, is there evidence that the meaning of posts on Instagram changes after regulation? Not more spammy or less spammy, just raw meanings. And the meanings of words in German move relative to Spain after the regulation. So I think this is the most sort of like raw data. You don't have to believe the machine learning classifications way to believe that there's something to study here, that the impact of these regulations is a change in the supply of the content on Instagram. And then finally, we do this all for the non-matched sample, and everything is fine. That's more data. But maybe a little less great, because we're sort of comparing apples and oranges in some cases across Germany and Spain. Okay, so last thing I want to say is just sort of a concluding slide, and especially what we're thinking about for the future. So we have this new data set where theory suggests that disclosure regulations could kind of be good or bad for end users. And we find, consistent with the possible recent papers that suggest it could be bad, some evidence that there's increased sponsored content and increased undisclosed sponsored content, coupled with decreased engagement following this regulation. Of course, we haven't really told you anything about welfare because we don't think we can. And really the big picture goal of telling you more about welfare would really require a model that we were estimating per se, a structural model, so that we could do, for instance, counterfactual regulation schemes, measure welfare, and so on. We're really excited about doing that. And one of the reasons we're excited about doing that is because of this sense that I told you, that on the one hand, we're doing our natural language processing in step 1 to figure out how spammy these things are. And then in step 2, we're doing our inference about policy. We'd like to do that all under one roof. We'd really like to have a model where we were doing natural language processing in an economic model, where there were incentives to post things, and we were taking account of the incentives to post things when we tried to do our essentially estimation of whether or not a post is sponsored or not. We're not doing that right now. In step 1, we're being completely computer scientists. And in step 2, we're putting on the economics hat. We'd like to put those hats together. Okay, so thanks. It was really a pleasure to be here, and I'm happy to answer more questions.